Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be able to have a discussion today about the next era in healthcare with Robert Bradway, the Chairman and CEO of Amgen, and Stanley Bergman, the Chairman and CEO of Schein. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So that's a very broad topic that we talked about here about the next era in healthcare. So I'm going to try to focus by asking both of you some questions, but please feel free to add in your own comments and describe a little bit about your own background in terms of what brought you to where we are today. I mean, Amgen is clearly a leader in the marketplace and in innovation and in biotech and health tech, and Schein has been around since the Great Depression. So it was born during a crisis, and now I believe is very deftly dealing with a new one that we're living through now. So I'd like to start with you, Robert, and ask you what you see are the main lessons that you're learning so far, at least from COVID-19, in terms of how it's going to shape the future of healthcare.
Well, I hope the first thing that we're discovering is the power and speed of innovation in the biopharmaceutical industry. Yesterday, there was a great flurry of interest around one of the vaccine candidates that's moving very swiftly through clinical development, and early reports of efficacy levels well ahead of what might have been expected at this stage. So both the speed at which the medicines are advancing and the quality of the medicines is exciting. Similarly, yesterday, one of the neutralizing antibodies program that we're partnered with was also granted emergency use authorization here in the U.S. So, I think that the highlight of the environment right now is a recognition of the incredible innovation that is moving so rapidly to help try and break the back of this pandemic. So I'm optimistic that we can break the back of this pandemic. I'm optimistic that light we're beginning to see at the end of the tunnel is daylight and not an oncoming train. But it's been a challenging time for healthcare systems around the world. There's a second surge, obviously, taking place, particularly in Europe, maybe a third surge here in the U.S. So I think the hospital systems are in a much better position now than they were when first confronted with these numbers in springtime. But we still need to manage those patients who are infected until either therapies or vaccines are widely available.
And how have you managed to, or the industry in general, managed to develop these vaccine candidates so quickly when it's normally a process that takes years? And the same with some of the treatments that we're talking about, whether it's antibodies or other types of treatments. How has that been possible? It's something that maybe 10 years ago would have been considered impossible to do.
I think even 10 months ago might have been considered impossible to do. But I think the common thread between the strands of your question, that of vaccines and therapies, is that the industry has approached this with an all-hands-on-deck mentality. I think companies and other players in the ecosystem have been working very collaboratively together. I think the spirit of this has been, we have a challenge, let's address it, rather than who can win this race. And very importantly, I think we've been helped globally by regulators who have also had an all-hands-on-deck mentality and worked with innovators to understand what the very most efficient path would be from the moment of discovery to the moment of approval. So there's been no lag time in interactions between companies and regulators. The regulators have been able, I think, to see the big picture and to try to help innovators figure out what's the fastest way to move forward with the innovation. So really all across the board, people adapted very quickly, recognizing we had a global challenge on our hands and that we needed to be prepared to handle this differently from how we handle run-of-the-mill, everyday, ordinary course drug development. So again, so far so good, both as regards performance of the industry, performance of the regulators, performance of the academic institutions, performance of the capital markets, providing capital for these activities. And so I think, hopefully one day we'll be able to look backwards and feel grateful about the way in which the community of people with an interest in healthcare came together to quickly wrestle this thing to ground.
It's fascinating to think that issues like teamwork and collaboration and properly using technology are able to have such a profound impact on something that's so critical to everyone's lives. So Stanley, going to you for a minute, again, how do you think the DNA of your firm that was founded back in the crucible of the Great Depression and assist clients on the technology front, for example, how do you see your firm's culture and ability helping others and helping in this pandemic?
So Frank, it's good to be on this panel with you, and Bob, good to see you. Henry Schein is the largest provider of products and related services to office-based physicians and to dentists. We've been on the front line, of course, of PPE. So I think the biggest lesson we have learned, and many of us have known about this, is that, of course, viruses, epidemics, pandemics, do not carry passports. They don't have visas. We can't stop them at any border. The whole world is in this together. Of course, treatment, the way the pharmaceutical industry came together, public-private partnership is amazing. Same with vaccines. But the whole PPE world is very, very fragile. It may not be a big part of the GDP, but we need to ensure that for all the citizens of the world, all the people of the world, we have enough product to prevent the spread of a virus. And quite frankly, these are simple products: cleaning solutions, masks, and gloves. And there's an imperfect supply chain and extremely fragile. So at the World Economic Forum, CEPI was formed and Gavi was formed to deal with vaccines. And in 2015, we formed the Pandemic Supply Chain Network to deal with the supply chain issues. The World Bank, the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, and a number of companies got together. We need to continue to work with the CDC and equivalent agencies around the world to ensure that we have adequate product in place to prevent the spread of epidemics, pandemics, way before vaccines and treatments are there, and at the same time ensure that we have adequate resources dealing with testing. So this is what Henry Schein has been working on, and it's certainly not as exciting as technological breakthrough. It's basic supply chain. And yes, we will get through this pandemic. And yes, this pandemic will be a little bit in the rear view, but it's important that we at all times focus on making sure that not only the wealthiest countries in the world get PPE, but that the whole world gets PPE, because it's really in the interest of the wealthier countries as well as a moral issue. But pandemics can spread, epidemics can spread, viruses can spread if we don't have PPE.
So drilling down a little bit on that's absolutely critical point, and I think all of us have seen the extremely concerning beginning of the COVID pandemic, where people sort of, most people discovered that we didn't have the supply chain, at least robustly enough in place. What specifically, what are some of the solutions to that? Because I've heard, a lot about, well, we need to produce locally certain products. We need to have the ability to move things, not just from a single source, but from multiple sources. It needs government intervention or subsidy, or it needs the private sector. Sort of what are some of the lessons learned from that, or some specific things that need to be done to really strengthen that super fragile supply chain you're talking about?
Right. So, Frank, this requires global collaboration. Yes, there are some wealthier countries in the world, of course, the US, Canada, European countries, maybe a few Asian countries, that can afford to build local plants for masks, relatively easy, not so easy for gloves, and yes, for cleaning solutions. But there are 200 or something members of the United Nations. Not every one of these countries is going to be able to afford to build PPE plants. We need global collaboration to ensure that we get the right products to the right people right at the beginning of a virus. I would say the world did reasonably well with Ebola. We did come late, but I think it was the US, Canada, UK, and I think France that sent products to West Africa. Also too late, but a lot earlier than this time. The key here is to have global collaboration to ensure that we have adequate access to product, a well-working supply chain. No country is going to do it on their own. No country is going to make enough product for the whole world and get the product to the whole world, figure out where the next pandemic, the next epidemic, the next virus is going to start. We need global collaboration to move product quickly and ensure that we have a diverse availability of product. The manufacturers of the products this time, significantly in Asia, did a reasonable job, but the supply chain broke down. And so we need to ensure that there's an efficient supply chain for all countries and all peoples around the world.
Thanks, Stanley. And going back to you, Robert, what role does the biopharmaceutical industry play in responding to COVID-19, and how is Amgen contributing specifically to that effort?
Well, as I've already mentioned, I think it's been all hands on deck, the innovative biopharmaceutical industry, with efforts underway to try to find a vaccine, with efforts underway to advance what we call neutralizing antibodies, which would be therapies for people who have been infected with the virus, particularly directed towards those who are at greatest risk of developing more serious consequences of the infection. Efforts underway to advance antivirals, medicines that could interrupt the process of the virus replicating through the body after infection. And finally, medicines that are active in trying to prevent the immune system from over-responding to the viral infection. It appears that over-response, the immune system, is part of what leads to the need for patients to be treated in the intensive care unit, as their immune systems rev up beyond what's necessary to control the virus, creating a series of problems in and of themselves. So those are the four big areas where the innovative biopharmaceutical industry is actively involved, as well as in trying to characterize the virus and its consequences in the body at the molecular level. There's been an extraordinary amount of what we call sequencing of the virus going on, enabling us to do really real-time epidemiology for this virus in a way that's never been done for a viral infection before. So the speed and extent to which we're learning about the virus and the immune system to it, I think, is staggering at the moment. But Amgen is involved principally in two of those four areas. Our principal focus is on advancing a neutralizing antibody, which, as I mentioned, was granted emergency use authorization yesterday. So we're partnered with Lilly and delighted to be helping to advance that molecule, which is now approved, again, for patients that are suffering from infection and at high risk of the consequences of that. And we're also testing a couple of our medicines to see whether they might help prevent that maladaptive response of the immune system that I just referred to. So those are our two primary areas. In addition, we've been working with an academic lab on a very different approach to how we might vaccinate people against this virus. And still early days, but potentially paradigm-shifting approach to vaccine development. So the one area that we're not directly involved in is the antiviral research. But we're fortunate that as an industry, we have some extraordinarily effective groups that are actively involved in that. Many of you have heard about the success of Gilead with their product Remdesivir. And there are other products that are antiviral in nature that are also advancing through the clinic now. So again, I think the picture is an optimistic one. And I'll repeat what I said earlier, which is I think we can see a light at the end of the tunnel now, and I think it's daylight. So I'm hopeful that, when we get to the middle of 2021, we'll all be able to talk about what's been done to break the back of this pandemic, certainly in certain regions of the globe, and begin to enable us to return to a more normal life.
So that's actually very good to hear, particularly coming from someone with your level of experience. And I think it's very timely in terms of the exhaustion that a lot of people feel when these new waves are coming, and the concern that sort of creates. I did see a very strong market reaction to some of the announcements recently in the positive, but we all know that can be volatile, in terms of where we're going. So a more holistic view of this, I think, is a positive one is great. Looking beyond the industry itself, what lasting impact do you think COVID-19 is going to have on the way we think about and the way we provide healthcare in general?
Well, I'd be very interested in Stanley's thoughts on this as well, but I think there are a couple of really important things for us to recognize coming out of COVID-19. The first thing is the extent to which there are disparities in the healthcare system. Unfortunately, again, for people of color, I think in the United States, we can't ignore the fact that our African-American, Black, Latino fellow citizens have borne a disproportionate brunt of the impact of this pandemic. I think we need to understand what the causes of that are. We need to understand what the remedies for that are, but I just think we can't ignore it any longer. So that would be my first observation. Second, I think we're discovering that there are some different ways to connect patients with their healthcare providers. And just like we're able to gather using the technology tools for this meeting, physicians and patients can connect with each other using these same tools to prevent, for example, rural citizens from having to drive long distances to see their doctor, or to prevent a parent who's at home with children from having to find someone to look after the children so they can go be seen by the doctor. So I think that telemedicine, telehealth, offers a very attractive incremental way for us to connect people in need of healthcare with their providers. And so I'm hopeful that one of the lasting impacts of this COVID-19 experience will be that we've opened up a new avenue for connecting people with healthcare. And then finally, echoing something Stanley said, I think resilience, perhaps not in place of efficiency, but resilience with efficiency. I think those of us who've been running businesses and responsible for supply chains have been running them at a high capacity utilization, highly efficient, and that has served a purpose. But what COVID-19 exposes is the importance of being able to have resilience in the supply chain as well, so that a certain part of the world or if a certain part of the country is shut down for whatever reason for a period of time, the rest of the supply chain doesn't come grinding to a halt as well. So as a company, Amgen, we've been very fortunate that we've been able to supply every patient every time with our medicines, both in the commercial, so for drugs that are already approved by regulators, as well as for drugs that we're studying in a clinical trial setting. And in general, our industry, I think, has acquitted itself quite well with respect to the supply of medicine. But in healthcare more generally, as Stanley said, and as we all witnessed at the beginning of this pandemic, some of the basics, PPE, as Stanley described, were in short supply. And so, that's the kind of thing that I think all of us need to be more attentive to. The next challenge may not be a pandemic, it may be something else, but whatever it is, we can't afford to run out of the basics, and we can't afford to run out of the advanced either. So it's a combination of resilience to go with the efficiency that I think you've seen created in the industry over the last several decades.
Thanks, Robert, and I'll take you up on that. Stanley, what is your view of that exact same question?
Well, I vehemently agree. So we need, of course, the high technology, the high innovation, the science, which, of course, Amgen is world-renowned for, and there are many companies that are also doing this kind of work. On the other hand, I want to be just a little bit forward-thinking here and talk about the day after COVID. What are we going to do to ensure that we provide more healthcare to more people around the world, and that we move the healthcare systems around the world from fighting sickness to prevention? Because at the end of the day, that's important. And I think Bob said it correctly. telemedicine will be critical in this new world. We have remarkable technology. We need to take that technology. It's interoperable technology, very simple stuff that is available to the whole world if the world were to come together. So I'm a big fan, and I think there are many others that believe that it's better to prevent than to treat. And so I think we need to ensure that we use the available technology to prevent illness around the world as opposed to just treating sickness, which of course is important, but we need to have much more in the prevention area. And in this area, for example, there are a couple of areas that very often are missed. One of the biggest challenges we're experiencing now is in the behavioral sciences area. People are really tense. There's a lot of challenges in this area. We need to deal with that too. The area my company works in is oral care, dental care. There's a direct correlation between good oral care and good health care. That needs to be worked on as well. So I think we need to be forward thinking a bit. Yes, we need to get the vaccines out as fast as possible. We need the treatments. But the day after, we also need to think through how we're going to keep the world healthy. And we can do it because the technology, the know-how is there. We just need to provide access to many more people in the world, prevention and wellness. And then the vaccine. Very important that we ensure that the physicians are very much brought into the educating of the public on the various kinds of vaccines, corona vaccines that will be available, why they're important. I sometimes worry that the physicians, specifically in the US, are not being brought into the whole education program on the importance of vaccines.
So to that
Frank,
point,
I wonder if
Stanley,
I could
yes, go ahead.
I was just going to ask if I could pick up on that thread from Stanley about the importance of prevention. Again, particularly wake of COVID, where we know that many people with their chronic conditions have delayed visits to the doctors, skipped them altogether, in some cases interrupted their use of medicines during this period because of fear that they might catch the virus on those doctors' visits. And I share Stanley's view that one of the things we need to be very attentive to coming out of this crisis is preventing the downstream consequences of those chronic diseases. I would add the word predict to prevent. So like Stanley's vision that if we can predict who is at greatest risk developing a serious consequence, and if we can prevent that serious consequence from happening by seeing that they get the chronic therapies that they need, we'll be in a much better position than we were in for this COVID crisis. So the idea that we don't have to wait for somebody to have a heart attack or a stroke, we can predict today that those of our fellow citizens that are at greatest risk of heart attack and stroke, and we can prevent many of those heart attacks and strokes by seeing that those patients are on the right medicines, for example, to significantly lower their bad cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol. And there are lots of examples, osteoporosis, metabolic disorders, diabetes, and so forth. So lots of different ways that we as a society can reorient the way we think about healthcare away from fixing that which is broken to predicting and preventing that which hasn't happened yet.
I think that's fascinating, Robert, and you hit the nail on the head to the next question I was going to ask Stanley and then you, but it's really how the pandemic will impact the future of treatment of chronic conditions and how the not even new, the technology already existed, but the fact that delivery systems now utilizing some of these technological advances we've had to reach more people. And so I hear a strong endorsement from Stanley on the connection between oral care and overall health care, which is very well known scientifically, but not sort of talked about a lot. And it reminds me a little bit of a lot of the schooling you're seeing at home via video. Well, that technology existed. It existed to do what we're doing today, but it wasn't broadly used, and it certainly wasn't broadly used in the healthcare industry. In part, probably because of regulatory hurdles, but in part also just because people didn't see the need to adapt to it. So how do you see the pandemics impacting future chronic care, and how do you see these delivery methodologies we have helping with what we're talking about, helping prevent, helping predict, and helping treat these conditions?
Well,
yeah, please.
Stanley, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bob.
I would say, starting on our end, Frank, we've learned through COVID-19 some new ways of being able to make sure that medicines get to our patients, even if they can't visit their doctors or the clinics. I think some of the workarounds that we and others have developed for our individual products for patients that are suffering from chronic diseases, which means that they require regular medical intervention or regular drugs or regular supervising by healthcare professionals. We've developed some workarounds, and I'm hopeful that those will remain in place, that payers will continue to support them after the COVID-19 challenge passes. And I think, again, what we have to recognize is that COVID has placed an unprecedented burden on us. It's imposed an economic shutdown that was greater than anything we've experienced since the Great Depression, but also at the same time, the greatest healthcare crisis we've seen. And we have the combination of those two events at the same time, those two issues at the same time, and the downstream consequence of that is going to be significant economic challenge country by country as we try to work down the debt and the cost of COVID-19 over the coming years. And against that backdrop, we can't afford to waste money on heart attacks and strokes that could have been prevented. So we have, I think, an economic, social, and even a moral responsibility to be identifying those of our citizens who are at greatest risk and trying to do everything we can to prevent them from developing diseases that are predictable and preventable. So, again, I think there's an economic urgency to this that perhaps didn't exist before COVID-19. I think there's a technological familiarity that didn't exist before COVID-19. I think there are just some, frankly, simple, plain workarounds that have been created in this period that we put those three things together, maybe we'll be lucky and we can start to bend the curve downward for the morbidity and mortality associated with these very common chronic diseases.
Thanks, Robert. And Stanley, do you have anything to add to that along these same lines?
Well, again, vehement agreement. It's very strange to use the term NCD, non-communicable disease, at this time, but there will be a day after this virus, and I think we need to focus on, of course, the key non-communicable diseases: pulmonary, cardiac, cancer, diabetes, behavioral, and even oral care, I think, needs to move up there. If we deal with these, we'll be well on the way to making sure that more people stay healthy, and we'll have to deal with less sick prevention. Treatment of sickness. Prevention is very, very important. Obviously, moving procedures out of the hospital into the alternate care setting and into the home. All of these areas are areas we have technology, we have know-how, we need government support, but the industry's private sector is also very capable of advancing prevention, treatment, out of the hospital, into the home, into the doctor's office. This movement had started before COVID, and I think will continue. It got an added boost from telemedicine.
So Stanley, along those lines, how do you see, I know you do a lot of, or at least some P3 work, some public-private partnership work. How do you see that helping this? Because I know part of the issue is where sort of government meets private sector in terms of, particularly when we're talking about prevention and prediction and supply chain and a lot of these different things that we're discussing. How do you see that working? And do you see any changes that are coming out of this pandemic?
Well, I think Bob recognized earlier in his remarks how well public-private partnerships have worked at this time. And it's been remarkable, the level of collaboration between different sectors of the economy and governments. I know in the US, for example, we had a rough time in the early period of PPE, of obtaining PPE products in the early period of COVID. But then there was the FEMA task force that dealt the government agency in the US. And these kinds of agencies I know exist in Canada and other parts of the world too, that got together to deal with ensuring that there was adequate procurement and that the supply chain was eased for PPE. Tremendous opportunity, I think, for advancing collaboration amongst the industry and between the industry, the government sector, academia, NGOs, and globally. I'm very, very optimistic about it. And, it leads one to the thinking of behind stakeholder capitalism, the fact that there are many constituents in society that need to work together. And I think one clear takeaway I have from this particular pandemic is that the business of business is no longer viewed as purely business. Business is expected to be part of society, and society is embracing business. And so this collective stakeholder capitalism, I think, has gotten a big momentum. And it's so exciting to see how the public markets have adopted the notion that ESGs, companies that are committed to society in general and put their capital towards advancing the needs of society, are adding tremendous value. In fact, there's been a huge surge in investment in the ESG world that have emerged, showing that companies that are committed to advancing the needs of society actually have a better rates of return than companies that are not. So I'm very, very enthused about where the public-private partnerships are heading, and that I believe the whole world has gotten a big boost in this area as a result of the pandemic.
Fascinating. And Bob, we've seen a huge amount, of new investment capital flowing into biotech and biopharma, really unabated over the past several years. And that hasn't slowed down at all during COVID-19. If anything, it may have sped up. What do you think is motivating this intense investor interest? And is it a blessing or are there any concerns around that?
Well, it's both. But I guess I would start by observing that the world is awash in capital, and that the response, for example, of policymakers to COVID-19 has been to add liquidity to the system. I think against that backdrop, investors looking for high risk, high return areas to invest in have been drawn to biotechnology. This is clearly an industry that is evolving very rapidly. So some of us call this the BioCentury. We think the progress that will be made in understanding biology this century will come to define the 21st century. And that has attracted a lot of investor interest. There are still many chronic diseases, as we've discussed, and other illnesses for which there aren't good or adequate therapies today. So capital is being drawn to this industry to try to break the back of that, try to discover new drugs that can make a big difference for patients around the world. So I don't think that's going away anytime soon. So on one hand, that's obviously good news. On the other hand, there is an Adam Smith moment, right, when those who've allocated capital to areas and not earned a return have to suffer the consequences of that. And unfortunately, even in COVID-19, we'll see that happen. So we have literally hundreds of therapies being explored now in preclinical and clinical trials to address the COVID-19 challenge. And obviously, not all of those are going to get approved. Not all of those are going to earn a return on the risk capital that was invested to advance them. And so, there will be boom and bust locally and, beyond for biotech investors. But hopefully the net result of all of this will be progress in our understanding of biology and disease and therapies to treat and prevent.
So one of the questions we received by folks that are listening is, do you think it's the duty of pharma companies to work on the prevention of disease?
I think different companies have different views of their strategy. At Amgen, our focus is on trying to advance innovative medicines that make a big difference to patients that are suffering from serious disease. And in particular, we're trying to focus on some of the diseases which impose the biggest burden on society today. So, for example, there is no disease more burdensome to society than heart disease. It is the single largest killer of people in every country and every continent on the planet. And so we're investing heavily in innovative research and development to try to change that with therapies like our drug Repatha, which significantly lower LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, and other therapies as well. So again, I think every company has the responsibility to set its own strategy. The leaders of companies have a responsibility to allocate capital in such a way as to be able to earn a return on it. And that return enables you to continue to do the things that are core to your strategy. Again, in our case, it's try to serve patients with innovative new medicines. And that's what we get up in the morning to try to do. We get up in the morning, try to discover an important new medicine. Today, we were fortunate to be announcing that one of our medicines for asthma, a drug called tezepelumab, met its primary and secondary endpoints in its pivotal phase 3 clinical trial. So that's an exciting day for us, and it gives us the opportunity to treat patients suffering from severe asthma around the world with a new innovative therapy, which for those whose disease is not well controlled, I think will come as good news. So, that's what we get up out of bed in the morning to try and do. And, if we're successful in advancing new medicines and treating patients with them, we get to do it again tomorrow. So that's how I would answer your viewer's question.
So also, Bob, where do you see the growth coming from for Amgen? I know you have a concerted focus on growing in Asia, for example. Is there a geographical differentiation there, or is it more by the types of products and services that you're working?
Well, we'll grow through two different means. One clearly will be international expansion. We're a relatively recent entrant to Asia with our own business. We've historically, over our 40 years of existence, relied on partners in Japan and China and the rest of Asia to a great extent. Today, we have, really for the first time in our history, control of our own business throughout the Asian region. So that will be an important contributor of growth for us. Obviously, we expect Europe and the United States to continue to be important sources of growth for us, given the aging demographic in those regions. And then finally, I would observe that in other parts of the world, Brazil, Turkey, other parts of Latin America, as the middle class continues to expand rapidly, we expect there will be growth in the diseases associated with increasing wealth. Unfortunately, those are the obesity-related diseases, for example, and diseases associated with urbanization, respiratory disease, like I just discussed for asthma. So we would expect that we will also grow in those regions as the middle class continues to emerge and as the lifestyle-related diseases of the wealthier countries spreads across the globe. So we're optimistic that geographic expansion will be an important part of our growth. And then, I would say that we're in some disease areas where there are millions and millions of patients around the world suffering from the disease who would benefit from our medicines. And so we think we will continue to expand volume, even in the markets where we already have very strong shares, like the United States and Europe.
Thanks a lot for that. Stanley, so going back to the points you were making related to social responsibility and diversity and inclusion, what are your thoughts on the global movement on racism and social injustice?
Well, I think, Frank, the world is much more focused on this area of diversity and inclusion. I think this time there is a lot of seriousness about it. The world has been thinking, particularly I'm talking about the United States now, has been thinking about this for a while. But now I think it's expected that companies actually do something about it. And yes, the diversity has been on the agenda for a while, the statistics, but it's the inclusiveness that I think is getting a huge boost. I hear this from CEOs of many companies around the world, and our teams are hearing it from suppliers that we work with. The whole notion of a D&I council, a diversity and inclusion council, was or something like that. The whole area of inclusion, ERGs, greater inclusion, I think has been something that has been important. Companies have looked at it, but I think we've gotten a huge boost, and I see a lot of authenticity in companies today working on addressing these issues. I believe that employees in companies around the United States, and I'm sure in Canada and other parts of the world, are ready to talk about the issues and are expecting companies and leaders to deal with the issues. I think it's not good enough any longer for a CEO to be focused on the shareholders, on the customer, and perhaps on the suppliers. But what is really important now is to care about societal, the challenges of racial injustice, the inequities that have existed in the United States and elsewhere in the world for a long time. And so I believe there is a lot of sincerity today in addressing the D, but importantly the I.
And so going back a little bit to you, Bob, on this, you mentioned earlier that COVID-19 sort of shined a spotlight on some of these inequalities, particularly in the United States. I think you were talking about in terms of racial and ethnic minorities and the differing standards of care, the differing rates of, for example, death rates and other associated things. How is Amgen addressing these inequalities and helping to improve inclusion? Taking Stanley's point, inclusion, I guess, even more than diversity, and sort of both within the company and in the broader community as a whole.
Well, Frank, we're trying to address it comprehensively. It starts with our clinical trial efforts, working to make sure that we're able to achieve broader representation of minorities in our clinical trials as a company, and then as an industry. And we are making real progress in both our individual efforts and our industry efforts. Our industry association will make some announcements here over the next day or so about our principles for diversity and inclusion in clinical trials, that I think will represent real progress. So, again, clinical trials are just one more area where we have to accept and recognize that there have been disparities, healthcare disparities. And there are segments of our society that have not had access to clinical trials, haven't been willing to participate in clinical trials, fortunately to their detriment. So we need to acknowledge it. We need to understand the reasons for it. There are important historical reasons for it. And we need to come up with solutions to address it. So it's the right thing for society, and it's the right thing for business. And I think what the COVID experience and the social unrest of the spring revealed is the importance of having equal opportunity across society, equal opportunity, social justice across everything that we do in society. So we're part of focusing on this question comprehensively, and I'm pleased that we can point to specific actions and progress that we've made in our clinical trial efforts, and we will continue to do that.
Thanks, Bob. And just lastly, for you, what recommendation would you give people just in general in terms of a focus on prevention? What can they do? What can we do to be focused more upstream on the prevention side of healthcare?
Well, I think chronic disease imposes a huge toll on society and on our healthcare systems. And I think the key to chronic care is engaged patients. Patients who talk to their doctors about their heart disease, for example. Patients who ask their doctors whether their LDL cholesterol level is low enough. Patients who are interested in working on ways to improve their chronic care. We have great medicines available today. Fortunately, we have far too many people who are not availing themselves of those great medicines. So an engaged populace, I think, is an important next step.
Thanks, Bob. And Stanley, just a final question for you. If you were addressing the United Nations today and you had one piece of advice to give everyone sitting there looking at you, what would you tell them?
Well, I would deal with two things. One is the prevention, by the way. And in that regard, of course, medicine is important, but exercising, taking care of your weight, no smoking, these are the things that we need to work on. talking to the United Nations, I would say one thing. We need to work together on ensuring that prevention is in the forefront of the world's leading government, in the NGO world, and of course on the science side, but also that we're dealing with this PPE issue. We could have prevented a lot with a little bit of money, relatively small part of the world's GDP, and global collaboration. So I would appeal to make sure that when we get through COVID, we don't forget about the fragile nature of the whole PP&E supply chain.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure. I hope we are able to do this again sometime soon. And to all of those listening in, I hope it was useful and rewarding. And everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you.